Why the hell do we tolerate shitty behavior from the one person that's supposed to love us the most?
Because what we really want is to have no conflict, right? We want everything to be okay. And most high-functioning codependents are exactly, as the description says, high-functioning, and we are very good, very capable at getting things done, managing, controlling, making sure everything is happening the way it's supposed to. When you are an HFC, you are so habitually used to energy out, right? What am I doing for other people? We see the other person's difficult behavior as something for us to fix, as something for us to twist ourselves up in a pretzel and light ourselves on fire to give them what they need. And I think that we're more dialed into the feeling states, the desires, the wants, the needs of our partners or the other people in our lives than we are our own. But because we're so capable, we feel like, I haven't tried everything. Maybe this is just a misunderstanding, or maybe they're just having a bad day, or maybe we have a tendency to make excuses for other people's bad behavior, partly because we're not sure how to handle having a hard conversation, an honest conversation. Codependency at its core is an overt or covert bid to control other people's outcomes.
Why on earth then is high-functioning codependent usually attracted, and you see the dynamic often that you talk about in your book, with narcissists?
Mm-hmm. It's a match made in heaven between a high-functioning codependent and a narcissist. Until all hell breaks loose, which it will, because you have a narcissist who's like, it's all about me, or focus on me, everything's about me. And then you have the codependent who's like, great, it's all about you. I'm gonna focus on pleasing you and fulfilling your needs and having you think I'm the best, right? Because think about what a narcissist does when they get us into a relationship, right? If you've ever had a relationship with a narcissist, it starts amazingly, that there is all of this love bombing where they are looking at you like you're the most special, you're the most beautiful. Sex is amazing. They make promises, and they're inundating you a lot of times with gifts, taking you away, just saying how special you are, because they had never felt this way before about anyone, where it's like too much, too soon. And it's almost like shock and awe of like positivity and love and expecting you to be returning that. They're asking you questions in the first couple of weeks of a relationship, like, when are we going to move in together? Let's talk about the names of our children. But if it feels too good to be true, there's a part of me that really feels like it probably is. So you want to put the brakes on. But back to your original question, why it is such a match made in heaven is because the codependent is the overfunctioner. And the narcissist is going to be the underfunctioner and is going to benefit from all of what you're willing to do for them to make their life easy and pleasurable in the way that they want it. But you have to understand there's a whirlwind experience at the beginning that it's just like a drug. When you think back to the beginning of somebody getting addicted to drugs, they're romancing the high, they're thinking about how amazing it was, forgetting about how painful it was and that they lost their home or they lost their relationship or whatever it was, right? Just chasing that high. And I feel like this can be the same in these types of abusive relationships, where we remember back to how beautiful it was when they took us to Paris for 4 days, or, how great the sex was. These are real visceral memories. And yet we also have to look at the bad things and what you tolerated and why you tolerated those things. So according to me, codependency is when you are overly invested in the feeling states, the outcomes, the decisions, the relationships, the finances, the circumstances of the people in your life, to the detriment of your own internal peace, right? It might even be the detriment of your physical health, your psychological health, your financial health. It's your overinvestment, your over sense of responsibility and anxiety and fear about what other people are doing that is messing with your own internal peace.
So give me an example.
Your partner doesn't go to work because they're hungover. Their office calls and says, oh, are they homesick today with the flu? They said they had the flu. and you say, yes, they have the flu. That should have been their decision. Like, I don't know, talk to them, right? But instead, we're covering for them. It's really doing things for people a lot of times that they can and should be doing for themselves. And the irony with high functioning codependency is that the more capable you are, the less codependency looks like codependency, but it is still codependency, and we're still suffering from what codependency, the ways that codependency diminishes our satisfaction and joy in life. We just don't know why. So I opened the book with a story about when I was younger, that I was in Long Island. I was on a train platform at 10:30 at night. This is the late 80s, you guys, in New York. I'm heading to New York City. And there's a kid on the train platform just like standing there looking lost. I go, what are you doing? He's like, yeah, I'm just gonna sleep in Penn Station. I was like, no, you're not, Billy. Have you been to Penn Station? You're gonna get mugged. You can't sleep in Penn Station. It's dangerous. He was like, well, I don't know anybody in New York. I was like, yeah, you do. You know me. I literally took this kid to my apartment without even calling my roommate. This is a true story. I took him home, and not like that. Like, I don't want you to get mugged is why I took him home. All right, he left the next day without incident, right? So it could be a cautionary tale, but it doesn't have to be. The reality is, it never entered my mind. I felt so overly responsible for a perfect stranger that I couldn't even let the chips fall where they may for some guy I don't even know. Now, you guys watching, listening, you may be like, wow, that's extreme. Think about it though. You have your own Billy stories. Every single one of you have felt overly responsible for a cousin who thinks that you're close friends, but you don't really want to be friends with them. But they invite themselves to your bachelorette party. You don't know how to say no. Like, being overly responsible, feeling overly responsible for others, and doing things for people that they can and should be doing for themselves. Auto advice giving, making decisions for people, auto accommodating people out in the world, right? I tell the story in the book of, I'm at my hair salon. This is on a really busy Saturday, and I've got a mask on my hair, and I'm laying in the sink. And all of a sudden the sink line is getting long, and I'm getting anxious, like, why am I taking up a place at the sink when I could move, like I could go somewhere else. So I call over the assistant and I say, hey, you know, I'm happy to move. And she's looking at me like, yeah, lady, we got it, thanks. We do this every Saturday. Why does that story matter? It matters because what is the cost of me worrying about something that is not my responsibility, not my concern? I could have been laying there listening to your podcast. I could have been laying there meditating. I could have called my mom. But instead, I was overfunctioning and getting anxious, actually anxious, about the sink flow at my hair salon. Not optimal use of my time. And I'm not the only one that does this. So when I see this with my therapy clients all the time, just being out there in the world where you see something, you're like, oh, do you need directions? Do you need help? And I hear all the time from the internet, well, what's wrong with being nice? Just being nice. And I say, first of all, there's nothing wrong with being nice. But if you can't not do it, you're not being nice. You're being compulsive. And this is like an addiction, this behavior, just like anything else. I never talk about curing HFC. I only ever talk about us being able to go into recovery. And it's a daily discipline.
That anxiousness that you were talking about, I was just thinking about how that echoes in a relationship. So if you're a high functioning person and you're codependent and your partner is, you know, always making mistakes, looking for you to save them, like the anxiousness that must live in you all the time. So talk to me about that and how that can really come out in a relationship and why that can be so detrimental.
You can do this over functioning, over managing, over giving, auto advice giving, auto-accommodating, all perfectionism, all of these things that fall under this umbrella of high-functioning codependency, until you can't. The number of autoimmune disorders that I see in my therapy practice is just off the hook. And what happens is the cortisol and all of the adrenaline that is pulsating through our system when we are hypervigilant about trying to control what's happening between these two people when we are triangulating ourselves in other relationships where we don't want the sister to be mad at the mother, and so we're talking to both people and we are being overly responsible. That your body doesn't know the difference. Your body is going into fight or flight, freeze, fawn, and this is so bad for your nervous system, for your physical health. And I'm hoping that for anyone who's feeling this frustration and feeling like there's got to be more to life than what they're experiencing, and if they're feeling put out, underappreciated in life, sort of used, like, they're there to help other people, but nobody's really checking back on them. Think about how much information you know about the people in your life. Who eats what, who doesn't like who, whose politics is what, who, all the things. We have a stadium of data in our mind about other people. And so much of the time, we don't even know that much about ourselves. And if we do, we don't share it with other people, because one of the telltale signs of being an HFC is that we're good givers. We're crappy receivers. I do not want you doing something for me, although I can't wait to do something for you. And, it puts us in this double bind because we feel underappreciated, but partly we're not asking for the support that we need, or the time off that we need, or the help that we need in the home, right? Think about how much of the time women are doing all the emotional labor, especially if you have kids, especially if you're running a business, especially if you are taking care of aging parents. There's literally usually the list of what you do, if you write it down, is absolutely enormous. These two women were interviewing me, and one of them was talking about having a meeting with her partner the next day, a 7-hour meeting about the house. They had some kids as well. And she said, I started getting my list together. He probably does 20 things and does them well. But my list is like 450. So even when he's appreciative of me, I'm still resentful because I want to be like, you don't have a clue as to what I actually do in a day. And I'm like, yeah, man, but whose fault is that? He doesn't have a clue because you haven't given him a clue. Now, when you give the clue, is the behavior going to change? There's a lot of lack of equity in these codependent relationships. And what we're seeking, we want to go from codependency to interdependency, right? Where I count on Vic, Vic counts on me. There are some things he does in the marriage because he's better at those things. There's some things I do in the marriage because I'm better at them. And listen, we're not talking it has to be exactly 50-50. But if you need to control everything, because that's really what it is, right? A covert or overt bid to control other people's outcomes, feelings, situations, relationships, and nobody wants to be managed. There's a lot of resentment on the part of the manager because you're friggin' exhausted, but also on the part of the managee because it's condescending, right? And it's not that we mean to do it that way. We're doing so much of this out of fear. Fear that things will be out of control, fear that there's going to be a conflict over there, fear that your partner is going to get fired, fear that whatever your fear is. And all of these actions, so much of the time, are driven by fear rather than driven by love.
That resentment piece really hits me because it really does go the two ways. You feel like if you're doing 420 things and your partner's doing 20, you do start to build that resentment over time. You may not say it, and because you're highly functioning, you're like, I can handle it.
Yep.
So you just keep doing it, and resentment builds. And we both know the Gottmans who say resentment and contempt is one of the biggest sign of a divorce, I think by like 90% if you see it in a relationship. So understanding how that can really be detrimental to the relationship one way is super powerful, but then thinking about it to your point of the other way as well. Like my husband, if I didn't let him carry heavy things, he would start to resent that I didn't allow him to be the man in the relationship that he wants to be. Mm-hmm. And so while I want to be like, I can handle, I can carry my bags, I have realized that yes, I can carry them, but it doesn't serve the overall relationship. And I had to work on it, but understand it isn't that I'm not capable. And that was important for me to tell myself.
Yep.
you're very capable, Lisa, but this is important for your
Yep.
partner to feel seen and heard and appreciated. So how do I stop being that high functioning person in this moment and allow myself to give over to my husband so that it serves the relationship?
What you're talking about is on the other side. When we get into recovery from being an HFC, there's so much more allowing. We allow people to add value to our lives. We stop being like a lone wolf in a way, because there's a lot of hyper independence that comes, which may sound counterintuitive to people. Like, how am I codependent and hyper independent? You are, though. You're codependent because you are looking to fulfill and control the other person and do for them and make sure they have. But your hyper independence means that you're blocking it from coming your way. So you make this great point that you let Tom lift the bags or do different things that are a part of what make him feel good as a way to take care of you, or to show you kindness or deference, or treat you in a way that makes you feel loved and makes him feel loving to do it, rather than blocking it, because you know he knows you're capable, right? So it isn't like him wanting to carry your bag is insulting, it's loving. They're two different things. I like to say about Vic that he always, like, at the right and perfect times, he treats me like a fragile flower, even though he knows I'm a fucking warrior, right? He knows I'm a beast. It's not like I can't do it. Of course I can do it. But how good it feels to soften into and to allow him to treat me with that tenderness and with that consideration that he always does. And it's like, it's what makes the marriage work. It's not because I can't shovel snow. Obviously, if he were abducted by aliens, I would shovel snow. But he's always like, you don't need to. Go in and make tea. I'll be in 20 minutes. Like, yeah. But there's a kindness to that.
You mentioned earlier about cortisol. So that made me wonder, do people put on weight?
People put on weight or they lose weight. It could go either way, right? If you're not eating because you're so stressed out of your mind, or put on weight. People will come to me for that. TMJ, where they're grinding their teeth at night, and any kind of autoimmune disorder, from fibromyalgia to chronic fatigue, to there's so many that I've seen over the many years. I've had someone come in with lockjaw.
Oh God.
Yeah, like, you're being tense like this, being hypervigilant and stressed out of your mind for years. I have people come in, they've been doing it for decades. There is such a cost to your physical self, to your physiology, that is so important to handle. But a lot of these women, they would have kept going, but their body is what's giving out and sort of making them seek help. Thank God, and because it does get better. It can get better. You can get better. You can change what's happening that's not working in your life. But you have to first admit it. Even the most high-functioning women are tolerating things that they shouldn't be, because we are so high-functioning. So I think it would be so helpful if we literally just make a list. 10 things: people, places, things, attitudes, just circumstances, situation. It could be something as small as, I have a light in my office that I hate the light that comes out of it. It's super bright. Every time I put it on, I'm like, that we're tolerating that. Why aren't we changing that light, right? What else are we tolerating? I had this experience with one of my sisters who was in a bad relationship, living in the woods without running water and without electricity, with a guy who was doing crack, who was abusive to her, and she was an active alcoholic. So obviously, I don't need to embellish that story. That's literally the facts of the story. So as her sister, it was a nightmare. And I was so upset. It was like 5-alarm fire every day of how am I gonna get her out of there? And I remember saying to my therapist, what am I gonna do? Crying my face off. And she was like, Terri, let me ask you something. What makes you think you know what your sister needs to learn in this life? And I was like, I don't know, man. I think that we can both agree that she doesn't need to learn it in a house without running water and no electricity with an abusive guy in the woods. And she said, no, I can't agree with that, because I'm not God, Terri, neither are you. Do you know what's going on for you? And I was like, no, obviously. And she's like, you've worked hard to create a harmonious life. And your sister's life, being a dumpster fire, is super messing with your peace. And you want to tie that up in a neat bow so that you can get back to your life. And I was like, wow, you are not lying. That is not untrue. And yet it was painful, because I feel like as HFCs, we like to think of ourselves as, you know, I felt a little Mother Teresa-ish in the amount that I helped other people. I was like, you know, I'm just a lover like that. You know me, I just can't, you know, I just want to help. That's all I want to do. And then this made me realize, ooh, my desire to help Jenna was a little bit more about me than I had thought. And my therapist helped me see that I could create a boundary, and I didn't have to talk to her about this abusive guy, and that I could tell her, if you're ready, whenever you really want to get out of there, though I'm still your person, which I did. And within 9 months, she called me. And she was like, are you still my person? I was like, I'm putting on my shoes right now. Yes, I am. Went and picked her up. She left, got in recovery, went back to school. And the point of that whole story is that instead of me being the hero in Jenna's life, Jenna got to be the hero, as you instruct us all the time, to be the hero of our own stories and the hero of our own lives. And how empowering it is to love the people we love enough to not center their problems on us and our grade A advice. I mean, I'm not saying cheer her on for being in a terrible situation. Of course I talked to her. Of course she knew that I thought that she should leave. Of course I wanted her to get in recovery, all of those things. But the way that I took it on, the way that I felt like it was my side of the street, was very high functioning codependent. And the bottom line is, it was not mine. It was her lesson to learn and her situation to fix. And if I had dragged her out of that there by police or whatever, it wouldn't have stuck. Because it only, you know, you can drag a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. And how would you feel if someone were dragging you? You would not like it. HFCs are the last people who like to be manipulated and bossed around, like when it comes to like what we should be doing. But we can't stop telling people what they should be doing.
Support for today's episode is from OneSkin. Now, guys, if you don't know OneSkin, I am obsessed with them right now. Now, I just turned 45, and there's zero problem with aging. But let's face it, getting wrinkles isn't exactly something I would wish for, even though I'm embracing them. So what I'm doing is I'm using my OneSkin products right here. I've got my face wash, I've got my moisturizer, and I've got this one that is especially for the eyes. Now, I'm using OneSkin to help me as I age, to make sure that I keep my skin fresh, that I keep it nice and looking really healthy. That is so important to me. And right now, you can actually save 15% off if you go over to oneskin.co and use the coupon code Lisa. That's oneskin.co, use coupon code Lisa. I'm telling you guys, you will not be disappointed.
So let's talk about let's talk about some of the behaviors of high-functioning codependency.
Yeah, you actually talk about the 6 archetypes that are high-functioning codependent. So I'd love to go through a couple of these.
Sure.
So you say number 1 is the director. Then you say number 2 is the entertainer. 3 is the hyper-helper. 4, the auto-accommodator. 5, the perfectionist. And 6, the fixer.
So the director is someone who is more of an extrovert. And they're more of like the boss, that people know you are the boss. They know the best place to eat. They're great at what they do, but they also have a very clear sense of right and wrong, and they're pretty judgy. They can be pretty judgmental if you're not doing things the way that they think that you should be doing them. The entertainer is a little bit different. This is someone that lightens the mood. They're funny, they're a great storyteller. They're also auto-accommodating people. Like, oh, you need the car, I'll Uber, it's fine.
So very like self-sacrificing.
Self-sacrificing, but they're also always making sure that there's not a problem in the room. They probably were the sort of the clown in their family of origin. They were the one that was relied on for entertainment. But there's all these unconscious reasons that they are doing that, right? If I'm telling a story that I'm in control, that everything is okay, right? If I'm making people laugh, especially if you had parents, let's say, who fought, but then you could be funny and you could lighten the tension. Again, controlling the atmosphere, controlling the environment around you.
You've mentioned a couple of times the auto-accommodator. Talk to me about that and then how that shows up in a relationship and why that's so detrimental.
Auto-accommodating is where we see a need and we just accommodate that need, even if it's not in our highest and best good. So it could be something as simple as you're online, you're on the 15 item or less line, and you have 10 items and the person behind you has one, and you're like, oh yeah, go ahead of me, of course. There's a lot of self-abandonment when we're accommodating what other people want and need. And if you're an auto-accommodator, a lot of times they're not even asking you to. Right? You're like, oh, I know you were tired last time we met on Wednesday, so let's make it for Thursday. It's okay, I'll rearrange what I'm doing for Thursday. So much of the time, someone's not even asking us to do it. But an auto-accommodator is always on the prowl for a problem that we can fix.
And in those situations, because I have felt this many times where I feel like I'm being taken advantage of.
And I want to say, are you though? Because I felt the same way when I was younger, where I was like, if my boyfriend were just not a jerk, and if my boss was different, and if my best friend hadn't done this. And my therapist was like, hello? The common denominator in all those relationships, it can't be everyone else, Terri. You're the common denominator. And it made me realize where I felt like they were taking advantage of me, what was really happening is I was offering myself up on a silver platter, and then nobody was being as grateful as I thought they should be being for all of my sacrifices that they never asked me for. I was like, where's my parade? Where's my medal? I would like someone to give me a standing ovation right now. They were like, no one even knew. They were like, who asked you to do it? Here's you doing it. So I think that the martyr complex can come into with all of these, but especially the auto-accommodators and that hyper-helper. That's another one, where there's just not a crisis that we cannot insert ourselves into the middle of. The hyper-helper can't stand it. Literally, I had a client who was working at a place for about 2 weeks, and someone who was working there for 20 years was retiring, and nobody was doing anything for this guy's retirement, and she got a cake and had a retirement party. I'm like, you don't even know this guy. But she couldn't stand how it made her feel to think about this guy that she's known for 2 weeks, how he would feel. Maybe he hates parties. Maybe it's not the culture of what they do at this business. But again, she took it upon herself. She was positive it was the right thing to do. And that's like, right thing for who? To soothe your anxiety about the way a virtual stranger might feel. And those people saying, what's wrong with being nice? Nothing's wrong with being nice. But that's compulsive. She didn't even think about it. She spent her own money to do it. She didn't even ask anyone how they felt about it. She was like, we're just saying goodbye to George on Thursday. Like, she just made it happen. And that is hyper-helping to a degree.
You said it earlier where you said, we're always trying to make the peace, like how a lot of us will then make excuses for the other person. And you say, if this, then that. And actually have a list that you've written out, which I'd love to go through a few.
Sure.
As a sign of anyone listening that if you're telling yourself this, you could potentially be an HFC.
Yeah.
So you've got, if I can just find the perfect words to express myself, then he'll be able to hear me and want to change.
Yeah. Well, that is magical thinking, and it's very much a child's thought, right? Because with kids, if you have like disordered parents, if you live in a chaotic situation, kids will say, if I just do better in school, maybe dad will stop drinking. Or if I just am a really great athlete, then my parents won't fight because they'll be so focused on me doing good. Like little kids, we take it on ourselves. You're not going to find the perfect words if who you're talking to is unwilling to do their own work. Even if there were such a thing as perfect words, and I give them to you, there's lots of scripts in this book as well, you can't change the way that they respond. It's not about having the perfect words, it's really about having the courage to assert yourself and then having the guts to let the chips fall where they may. Deal with reality. What is real? What can they handle? What are they willing to do? Just open your eyes wide and just handle what's happening.
I think quoting your quote that actually made me laugh out loud. It was something like, "It's as if you go to the gym to try and help somebody else's diabetes."
Yeah, right.
Made me laugh. I was like, yeah, that feels about right.
It's so true.
Okay, if I can pick the right time to ask her this favor, then she'll show up for me like I do for her.
And why we know that is, again, magical thinking, is that it's not about the right time. That person knows what you've been doing for them, and they either have the capacity and the desire to show up for you in a similar way, or they don't. And so it's not on you. This is such codependent thinking, right? If I do it perfectly, I'll get what I want. That's not the way that it works. Just having the courage to ask for what you want is enough. And then we have to let the chips fall where they may.
Yeah, God, every time we're talking about this sort of thing, I've spoken to you and Dr. Ramani so much about narcissistic relationships. And I think about how so many people try to mold themselves into being the perfect person that the narcissist wants just to feel accepted.
Yeah.
And I mean, spoiler alert, I think everybody knows that it never ends up like that.
Exactly.
But you do in that moment where you're like, because if you've done something for somebody and you see that spark and you see them smile, you just remember that. And you spoke about it earlier. It's like that wonderful moment that you had, you're trying to relive. So you're always trying to make that person smile, that one time that you remember you did something, you made them feel good. And so I can understand how that just gets us into this complete loop.
Yes, and really with those types of relationships, we're also just so desperately trying not to be a target of the meanness and of the criticism and of the accusations and all the stuff that comes with that type of a relationship, where you're just literally, it could be like an Olympic sport walking on eggshells, where we're constantly like, whoa, doing anything to avoid the landmine. But of course, if the person really is a narcissist, you won't be able to avoid it forever, because their need to explode and make you wrong is there because that's how they get their supply, whether you did anything wrong or not.
I used to think about a person that was with the narcissist was the weaker person. Like they didn't have the strength. But to your point, and the thing that you talk about in the book and so much of your messaging is, when you're high functioning, it is the opposite. And when I would look at successful women, I always got so surprised when I would then hear that they got themselves into this super controlling relationship. Because I was like, she's such a freaking badass. She's a boss. No one tells her what to do. And then you hear about the behind the scenes of how they get trapped in these relationships.
But look at it. If you're really high functioning, it means that you have all these balls in the air, and one of those balls is making it look good. We care what other people think. So we're hiding what's happening at home. If you're in one of these really toxic relationships, you don't want to tell the people in your life because you're ashamed, because there's a part of you that knows that this is not good and not good for you, and yet you just can't imagine ending the relationship, especially if you're trauma bonded. It is so hard when people who say like, well, they could have just left, just makes me so mad, because you're like, you don't know anything about psychology, you don't know anything about trauma, you don't know anything about being trauma bonded, because it's just like, just don't do drugs. Like, yeah, if people could just not, Nancy Reagan, they would not. That's not the way life is, right? It's very difficult. It doesn't mean it's not doable, but let's not minimize the effort that is required. And if you look at those high-functioning women who are in these bad relationships, the facade that they have erected is so rock solid that it takes a lot. A lot of times it takes the physical ailments that they come into my office with. Even though I'm a psychotherapist, a lot of times they're coming in because they can't sleep, or they're coming in because they've hit menopause, and their symptoms are they're so exhausted and beat and fried and burnt out that they're like, something's got to give. And they finally, of course, they want to learn how to meditate, or they want me to help them to sleep. But obviously what we end up talking about is the quality of their relationship. And then hopefully eventually, how can I help them extricate themselves safely?
And then so how does that reflect in a relationship over time? Because I've been with Tom for over 20 years. And so it's like, if I see him struggle, of course I'm going to be jumping in and helping out. So where's that fine line between this is actually detrimental to your relationship and your dynamic versus this is exactly what makes a great relationship?
Yep. Well, the question is, when you're jumping in, is it wanted? Is it asked for? Is it appropriate? Because you just seeing a need and jumping in, even for Tom, and me doing it for Vic, not appropriate, because we're taking away their autonomy. I'm not talking about making the coffee in the morning, right? That's not what we're talking about major things, where we by making assumptions, what we're really doing is assuaging our own anxiety about them not feeling great about something or about them being in some kind of pain. So instead of jumping in, the healthy thing to do when you're in recovery is to say, how can I best support you in this situation, babe? Let me know what would help, what would feel good to you. Ask them. Don't assume that you know.
I'd love to actually push back a little on the coffee thing though that you said, because I'm going to give an example of my own life. Recently, Tom and I went away on vacation. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to be a really good wife. Like, he keeps saying he wants some more nurturing in our relationship. So I feel like I've really heard him. So I'm going to unpack for us, right? We're on vacation. I'm going to hang up all his clothes. So I hang it all up. Not one freaking word, Terry. He doesn't say thank you, nothing. And I'm just like, so I'm like, okay, you don't test your partner. Make sure that you say the words. Otherwise, I'm going to build resentment, right? So I'm going through this whole process. And so I say to him, hey babe, like I unpacked for you, like you've said that you really want me to do some wifey things. And he goes, yeah, but I don't care about unpacking. And in that moment, I realized, oh, just like with the coffee, if I'd made Tom coffee every single day for 30 years and he never said thank you, I think I would start to build resentment over it. Just like with me hanging up his clothes. But because I said something and I realized he doesn't care, I would have been the person that then in 20 years feels taken advantage of because I've been hanging up his clothes, cooking for him, and I don't get a thank you.
Yep, exactly. And here's the thing. This is why communication, he says, I would like more nurturing. Babe, what does that look like? What would feel more nurturing to you? Is it me sort of hanging up your clothes, or is it me making coffee? I want to do it, but I want to do it in a way that is going to I'm not guessing that it's going to feel that way to you, because that's what matters, right? And I think the communication is key, because a lot of times, you know, I'll always say about how much Vic and I say thank you. And I always talk when I'm working with couples, how important being polite is. I don't mean being strangers. I mean being polite. Every single thing that Tom does for you, since he doesn't work for you, is a gift, right? Every single thing Vic does for me he's choosing to do it. And I'm not owed it. I'm really not. And so mutually, whoever makes the bed, we go, thanks for making the bed. Even though it may sound redundant and like it's like weird, it's not, because we have so much gratitude that's flowing back and forth in our relationship all the time. This is endlessly putting these deposits in the well of goodwill of your relationship. So when the shit hits the fan in life, someone gets sick, someone's parents die, whatever the thing is, which inevitably it will, you have more flexibility within the relationship. The durability is built on these daily kindnesses and these daily considerations and these daily communications.
How do you then separate between these are always really kind gestures into becoming this is now an expectation on both sides?
Yep. Well, we do a couples check-in, so I just call it the State of the Union, every other week, where we just stay in bed on a Sunday, longer than usual, get the times, get our coffee, and just talk like, what's going great? What are our gratitudes? What do we appreciate about what's happening, and what could we work on? What didn't work? But when you know you have designated time to talk about these things, you normalize having harder conversations, right? Because most of the time, we just don't want a problem, right? We just want to sweep it under the rug. We just want everything to be good. And if you're getting along, you're like, well, I don't want to bring it up. But when you don't, there's a cumulative effect of that resentment that we don't want, because that is damaging to the relationship. When you are a well-oiled machine, you know it's a give and take, but I still highly recommend being vocal about what you appreciate and about how you feel about them. And I mean, Vic and I actually do gratitudes every night, because the more we speak gratitude into existence, the happier we are. And the more people don't feel taken advantage of. It just takes a little thank you. I want to feel appreciated. He doesn't need to throw me a friggin' parade, but gratitude is very good for a relationship. And you have to be able to, the same way, you have to be able to say you're sorry. You have to be able to bid for that attention and that appreciation that you need without the other person being like, oh, do I need to throw you a parade?
I think that this happens a lot in relationships where you speak up, you sometimes may have the hard discussion, especially if you're high functioning. You're like, oh my God, can I actually say that I need the help? You get all the courage, the confidence to then speak up. You say you want the help, and they're like, oh my God, of course. And so you see them helping. You're like, phew, thank God. As a high functioner, at least for me, who's a very high, like controlling person, when someone says, yeah, I've got it, I'm like, great, now I can take my eyes off the ball. But then a week later or 2 weeks later, that other person then doesn't follow through or just gets busy. And so now you feel almost like you're worse off having spoken up, let go of the reins, let them take the control, and then they've dropped the ball than you would have been if you just controlled the reins all along.
I don't know that you're worse off. I will disagree, because controlling the reins all along is what gets you to the autoimmune disorders and the burnout and the exhaustion and the resentment and the martyrdom, which we really don't want. So when we change our dances, our relationship dances, because that's what we're talking about, it's going to take a minute. So let's not be so impatient. You may have to say it more than once. You may have to revisit it, which is why I like the idea of instituting a State of the Union meeting every other week to normalize having that conversation. Hey, we talked about this on Thursday. You said you would do this. I'm just lovingly reminding you that today is that day, and can you please do it? The reason why opening up communication and doing it from this loving place is so important is that if we want to change, we have to be able to talk about it. You have to be able to remind the person, because how can I trust you if you say you're going to do something and you don't do it? Now, you don't have to be perfect, and it can take a few tries before something changes, and that's okay. But you can't not say something, right? And I always say, like, even in the beginning of relationships, when people are just dating or just starting, I'm always like, early and often, we want to be asserting our preferences, our desires, our limits, and our deal breakers, which are our boundaries, because this tells us, don't we want to know sooner than later who this person is and how they feel about us having preferences, desires, limits, and deal breakers, right? If you wait 2 years into the relationship to reveal how you feel, you really set both of you up to be frustrated and to fail, kind of.
But what do you do in situations where, let's say, a parent of yours is maybe, I'm just going to throw the word out, but of course not everyone's a narcissist and not everyone's parents are narcissists. But if you have, let's say, a mother who does all the whole guilt treatment, you're not coming to see me, I'm your only mother, I'm going to die soon. Like, these are real kind of guilt trips that a lot of mothers play on their children. And you're a high-functioning codependent. How on earth do you start to break that cycle and let go of the identity that you're supposed to be there and make your parent happy?
I think that it's very personal for each person. And I think that you have to decide what you can do and still be healthy. How close can you be in relationship to your mother? Should your mother be in your VIP section if she's emotionally manipulative and harms you regularly? No, which doesn't mean you need to cut off contact with her unless you want to. It just means she should be in the mezzanine and you should not be telling her about anything that's important in your life or anything that really matters to you. You can do a perfunctory, obligatory relationship. So at least for some people, they need to do that. I've had many clients who they know they can cut off contact, but they can't because it doesn't feel right to them, right? It's an option. If you were abducted by aliens right now, someone else would be dealing with that narcissistic mother. They would. So I think that a lot of times with HFCs, one of our mantras is it has to be me. And on the other side of recovery, you realize it really doesn't. It really doesn't have to be you, because there's lots of other people who are capable in the world. And what we really want to look at is, am I on my side of the street? Or am I trying to clean up the whole neighborhood because I feel overly responsible for everything? And really, am I trying to control everything? Because that's so much of what it comes down to.
Yeah, you talk about part of that, I guess, manipulation, not quite sure what word to use, is that we feel the guilt and the shame, and then that very much keeps us in the way that we keep showing up and giving over. So how do we work through that shame, especially? And then I'd love to talk about the difference between the healthy guilt and the non-healthy guilt.
Yep. Well, let's talk about guilt first, because they're kind of connected. Where healthy guilt, I mean, we're conscious beings. So if you do something wrong and you say something snotty to Tom, because you're not feeling it this morning, you might feel a little pang of guilt. And now that little pang of guilt can inspire you to make amends and to go kiss him and say, I'm sorry, babe. You know, that was crappy what I said this morning. I just was in a bad mood, but it's not okay, and I'm sorry. Healthy and appropriate guilt, when we do something kind of wrong or not nice, it's okay. This is a function. This helps us be better people. Now, that's not what I'm talking about with HFCs, because most of the time we're not talking about that. We're talking about chronic guilt, which is a different ball of wax, where we feel guilty if we don't do all the things for all the people. We feel guilty if somebody is upset about something. We feel guilty if we don't do the thing the mother wants us to do. Now we're not even enjoying the day off that we had, that we didn't go see her because we're too busy feeling bad and like we should have just done what she wanted us to do. Right, so that's chronic guilt. So what do we do about that? I really encourage you to question that guilt. Did you really do something that you should feel guilty for? Or is it just a habitual response and you're just so used to feeling that way, that it's so familiar that you just go into autopilot with the guilt? Is it really horrible that I wanted to take my day off today, even though I see my mother every Saturday, all the time? I always schlep to her house and do the thing. Should I feel guilty that I took this one Saturday for a mental health break for me? The answer is no. I mean, if your mother's not on her deathbed that day, the answer is no. You don't need to. And I think that this is where becoming healthy, where we separate out. I'm separating me from my mother. My mother's desire is for me to abandon myself and acquiesce to what she wants on that day. My desire is to have a mental health day. That is the thing I must honor, is the thing I need to do. So I feel like it gets easier and easier to do when we start changing, we renegotiate our relationship with guilt and realize that so much of it is habitual. And if you stay awake in your life, you'll be able to go, no, you know what, that's just an old feeling. I'm just used to feeling that way. But actually, I've done nothing to feel guilty about. And I'm going to take the day and I'm going to enjoy the day because I deserve it.
There's something so interesting about, because you've been doing it habitually, it lends to more guilt. So the story you tell in your book about the mother with a tomato sauce,
Yes.
If you don't mind actually sharing that
Sure.
story, because I think it goes both ways with parents who also have kids, and then the guilt there was like, well, to be a good mother, you got to make your son tomato sauce.
Yes. So I had this client, and she came in because she was friggin' exhausted, I think were her exact words. And she had a son. And she was a very Italian mom from Bensonhurst, and she was retired. And yet, every single week, for a long time, she would do her son's laundry and make him tomato sauce. So now, when he moved into the city, when he was like 21, you're like, okay, that made sense. It made her feel good. She knew he had clean clothes, he had food to eat. Now he's in his early 30s. Like, she'd been doing this for over 10 years. And finally, after a bunch of sessions, she was able to say, I feel like he just takes it for granted that I'm going to do it. And I want to enjoy my retirement. I feel like I'm not working, and yet I'm getting up early because I got to get the sauce done before he comes. Because that's what she was exhausted. She was like, I'm getting up at 6. I'm like, why? Aren't you retired? And so we get into this whole conversation and start unpacking. Why does she feel like she has to do it? And is she ready to give it up And she said she was. And so we, did her whole boundary script and have the conversation what she was going to have with Michael. And she did. She ended up having the conversation. And what happened was he said, Mom, I have been feeling the same. I don't need you to make me sauce. I love your sauce. I'm happy to come here and have it. I don't need you or to do my laundry. But I thought you liked doing it. And I thought I was going to hurt your feelings if I told you I didn't want you to do it anymore. Now that may sound hard to believe, and yet it's very true that she loved him through these actions, and she never said anything. So how could he know, right? She's feeling like he's entitled, and yet she didn't tell him. And as soon as she did, and then they totally changed what they were doing. She stopped doing that. Now they're meeting once a week to actually have breakfast and sit and talk, and not just have it be about the sauce and the friggin' clothes. But we can get into those habitual behaviors, and sort of, if you love people with actions like she had done, you end up feeling how she felt, where it's like, well, now I have to do this action, that he expects me to do this. You can renegotiate your relationships and your commitments at any point. So remember that you have the right to make mistakes, to course correct, or to change your mind.
Oh yeah. I want to ask you, after I read that story, what would you have guided her if her son turned around and was like, but Mom, I thought you loved me. I thought you wanted to make me happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the guilt trip.
Yep.
What would you have advised her if he'd responded like that?
I see this is upsetting to you, and I'm sorry. Of course, I love you. And we're going to have to settle with meeting once a week for breakfast, or you can come to my house and I can show you how to cook the sauce. I'm happy to do that too. Like, I would have come up with 17 other things that she could have stayed grounded in her truth and in her love for her son, right? Because a lot of times people will feel threatened, and it wouldn't have been at all out of the realm of possibility for him to be like, I can't believe this, now my feelings are hurt, But when we want to change a dance, a relationship dance, we need to understand and expect and be ready that we could get pushback because the other person might feel threatened, that we're not going to love them the same anymore. So instead of us freaking out and being all butthurt about it, we need to stand firm. I see you're upset, and of course I do love you. And this is going to be a new adventure for us, Michael. It's, we've grown. I've grown out of the old agreement, but I love creating a new agreement with you.
I love that so much. Okay, so if one of the things you talk about is when you're trying to get out of this tendencies to really take control and things like that, one of the things you talk about is having to address our defense mechanisms, our auto response to things. So talk to me about the types of auto responses that we do so that we can identify that we do them as a roadblock into the healing of this.
All right, so I think auto advice giving is probably one of the most damaging to a degree. It's very difficult if you're an HFC to just talk to someone and not be really wanting to give them your 2 cents on what they should be doing. And a lot of us as HFCs have taught people that we have the answers for them and that they should come to us for the answers. So that's something that you want to shift, because the cost of doing that is the depth of intimacy in your relationship. So if your best friend comes to you and says, I have a problem, I think I want to end my marriage, but I don't know, what should I do? Instead of you saying, oh, I never liked him, please do. You don't do that, because she's probably not going to, and then you're going to be the bad guy. But you may say, hey, what does your gut say? What do you think you should do? So we learn to ask expansive questions to help the people we love get to their own answers. Instead of us being the hero, same thing with me and Jenna, right? I didn't have to be the hero. Jenna could be the hero. With the people we love, even if we have good advice, the truth is we don't know what they should do, because we don't know how they're going to learn what they need to learn in this life. And they have a right to be autonomous and sovereign, and we must respect that right, rather than our fear of them making a mistake drives us to tell them what to do. And it's not loving. That's about you. That's compulsive. right? I mean, listen, there is love there, but it's more about wanting to fix the problem. And people don't like to be managed, Lise. Nobody likes to feel like a project. It feels bad to be manipulated and controlled by someone else. So that's one, right, is auto-advice giving. Auto-accommodating, same thing. Why should we not do this? Because we will eventually become resentful. In our relationships, if we're always the one auto-accommodating the other person, if we're like, oh, I don't care, I'm easy breezy, no fuss, no muss, whatever you want is great, eventually that's going to be old, unless it's true for you. But what I find with my therapy clients, most of the time, the ones that are like that, they just don't want any problems. They don't want any conflict. Even a conflict that I want pizza and you want Japanese food is too much. They're like, I'm not even risking that. I'm just going to eat whatever they want to eat. I'm just going to do whatever they want to do.
Especially if you're in a toxic relationship and they have a tendency to blow up or have these, you know, heightened emotional responses.
Yep.
I can see that being even more so in that dynamic, because
Yes.
the last thing you want is for something to get out of place. You know, like if something's wrong or if their food isn't right, like you're always trying to fix things so that
Yep.
they don't explode.
Absolutely. You also are over-functioning. You're over-giving, right? We're doing things for other people that they can and should be doing for themselves. And this has to do with parents and children, adult children and parents, where you have some who are like paying someone's rent and they're 35, you're like, that's too old. That's too old. And what the parent is saying to the 35-year-old whose rent they're paying is, I don't think you can do it. The kid says, I'm afraid I can't do it. And the parent who is over-functioning for them and continues to infantilize them is basically the message they're giving, even if they don't mean to, is, I agree with you. You think you're a loser, and I agree with you.
And so does a lot of our high-functioning tendencies come from childhood that we've learned from our parents?
Yes, it's a combination of things. So you have your blueprint, the relational blueprint, I think that we were talking about before. We look at, what did we witness? Did you have a maternal figure that was a people pleaser, that was doing everything for everyone? That the woman we were talking about with the sauce, it wasn't just with Michael she was that way. She also volunteered at the rectory 3 times a week, and she also did food shopping for the guy next door, and she also, like, there were so many things this lady was doing. Again, a lot of it, high-functioning codependency stuff, taking responsibility for things that were not hers. There's a tendency to be endlessly judging, because there's an illusion of control that comes from this behavior. There's 2 things that I've seen that I think are really devastating for being an HFC. One is that when we're constantly hyper dialed into our surroundings to make sure there's no problems, to make sure we're going the right way, are you making the left up there? You're like the backseat driver, all the things. We are experiencing what I call life light, meaning it doesn't hit the same when you're so preoccupied here. You're not experiencing life in the same way. And it's really difficult to have really satisfying, intimate relationships when you're so hyper dialed into your surroundings. So that's one. And the second is this, there is this sensation, you know, being overly responsible for everything is very lonely. Right? It's like when we don't allow other people to add value to our lives, there can be an existential crisis that comes from that experience where you just feel like nobody knows you. And a lot of the times it's because they don't, right? Because we're so busy knowing them, we're so busy fixing for them, we're so busy accommodating. I'm not saying this from a victim point of view, right? Because nobody is asking us to do this. This is learned behavior. So the good news is you can unlearn it and you can do something different. But there's a glass ceiling of our own making that comes when you are an active, high-functioning codependent, because there's only so much bandwidth you have in life. So you're only going to be so happy. You're only going to be so successful business-wise. You're only going to be so successful romantically, because you can't possibly be bleeding the amount of life force, energy, and bandwidth that you bleed as an active HFC and climb those heights that you want to climb. So this is really urgent that people get into recovery from this. And look at it as an opportunity, not as like something's wrong with you.
Talk to me about the validation piece, because as you're talking, I really think about how being a high-functioning codependent, you get a lot of validation, I think, out of helping other people, right? You get the validation from people saying thank you, from people telling other people, oh my God, did you see what Lisa did?
Yep.
Like, I feel good about myself as somebody who always felt not confident, was bullied as a kid. When someone says thank you and looks at me with a bit of idolization, it makes me feel so good because I never had it. And so that wound, that poor Lisa that was in her early teenage years that never felt good about herself, gets tremendous, beautiful validation from people saying thank you. And for people saying, oh my God, you really helped me.
Yep.
But that then turns into utter freaking burnout for me.
Yep.
So I think that part of the letting go of that now forces me to look at where I get my validation from. How do you advise someone to work through that? And I'm just asking for a friend.
Of course you are. Okay, so this is where we have to work on ourselves, starting with knowing that what you want, what you think, and how you feel matters. And to be really healthy and in recovery, that has to matter to you more than what anyone else in the world wants, thinks, or feels. It is loving to take care of our own needs so we're not bleeding all over the people in our lives, right? You're not bleeding on the people who didn't cut you, as they say, right? When we take care of our own needs, when we love ourselves in a real way, when we're able to approve of ourselves, and sometimes that means we need to change something, right? You know, when people talk about our authentic selves and they love to act like it's a magic Tootsie Pop that in the middle is the authentic person, amazing. Like all I had to do was wait a minute and get there. That I never identify with that as a therapist. I feel like we have an authentic nature, but we have the power as humans to build and create our authentic self, to decide who am I going to be in this world? How am I going to be in the face of trouble, problems? How resilient am I? Am I loyal? Am I dishonest? Am I someone I can look in the mirror and feel proud of? Those are choices on a daily basis. Our validation needs to come from, am I living a life that I want to validate? Am I being a human being that I can validate because I'm decent and I'm good and I'm kind and I'm honest? So the self-validation, there's two pieces to it. It's being healthy enough to be able to take care of your own needs, but it's also living a life that you are proud of, being a person in the world that you are proud of. It's much easier to validate ourselves when we're doing that. Now, what do we do when we make a mistake? This is where our our overly blown up super ego, or like our punitive, making ourselves feel bad could come into play. And when you really love yourself, you realize it's okay to make mistakes. You make a mistake and then you talk to yourself the way you would your puppy or a 5-year-old kid that you love, instead of having that inner mean committee that's like verbally assassinating you. You go, you know what, babe? It's a long day. You made a mistake. It's okay. You're human. Let's learn something. Let's move on. So this is how we have a relationship with ourselves that makes it easier to validate ourselves, is because we don't expect ourselves to be perfect. And we're not. We're not gonna be. But you can work to be a good person, right? You can work to do the right thing in the world, even if every other mother effer is not. You can be the different one and do the right thing. And that makes it much easier to validate yourself.
This is hitting me really hard. Recently, I've been dealing with a lot of health issues. So I'm going through perimenopause, my hair's falling out, I'm constantly tired, forgetful, words are dropping out of my head. I mean, like the whole shebang. And so it has forced me to put my health first, where normally I don't. And recently, someone reached out to me. I hadn't spoken to them in over 10 years. They actually texted me once. That's a lie. They texted me once in 10 years because I went back, you can just look at the text chain. And it says, in 2020, they text you this. they reached out and they were like, hey, Lisa, so I've left my job and I built my own business and can you check out my business proposal? And once upon a time, I would have been like, well, it's a woman. I know her, haven't spoken to her in 10 years. But my internal dialogue, the high functioning codependent, the person that's looking for that validation, that's like, oh my God, Lisa's a girl's girl.
Yeah.
I normally would have said yes. And in this moment when she texted me, I was like, okay, I haven't spoken to her in 4 years. That was one text. Before that, it was 6 years.
Yeah.
And I was like, I really want to help her, but I said that my health was priority.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, shit, I can't help her.
Correct.
And in that moment, it was really hard for me to come to that conclusion.
Yep.
But I was so proud of myself. So going back to, I didn't actually even realize that I did it, but normally I would have got validation in being the person that said yes to help her.
Right.
But now actually I built my validation in saying, you made the right decision because it was hard to make and you still put your health first.
Yes. And here's the thing, you can also then put it down, right?
Yeah.
Instead of carrying all this crap around like little Sherpas, you said no and you put it down. You don't owe that lady anything, and you do owe Lisa something, which is to be top priority: health, rest, expansion, healing. That's what you owe yourself. And the shift in you and the growth in you is so obvious because you're able to prioritize your preference, your desires, your limits, and your deal breakers, and that's exactly what you did in that situation.
Thanks, my girl Terri, over here for teaching me. Okay, so that was a lot about guilt. So actually, let's now talk about shame.
Yeah. There's different ways that shame exists in us and why we have it. A lot of it is childhood stuff that creates more of a chronic shame, right? And then there are things that we could do in adult life that make us feel ashamed. But it's different than walking around with a lot of shame, feeling, guilt says I did something wrong. Shame says I am wrong. Something is monumentally broken about me. And they're very different things. And with Brené Brown's work, we're very aware that how does shame thrive? Secrecy, silence, right? We don't talk about it. We don't share it with other people. We think that we're less than. We're so afraid to be rejected that we don't let anyone know. So how do we combat shame? Talk. Get into therapy. Talk to a friend. Because everything that we experience in our lives, if we process it, if we talk about it, if we acknowledge it, we are weaving these experiences into the beautiful and unique tapestry of our one-of-a-kind life. But we can be stuck in shame. So one of the first things we want to think about, if you're feeling ashamed, if something goes wrong and you immediately blame yourself and you immediately feel like it's you, if you see yourself getting small around other people, if you're so afraid to be seen, then you know you've got shame work to do. And that requires journaling about it, writing about it. When did you first feel this way? Who are you responding to in that way? Who did they remind you of, right? Because we can get to these original injuries that created the shame, and that's what needs our attention. You are not responsible for what happened in your childhood. You were a child. So if something terrible happened to you, that's not on you. That isn't about you. And the little kid in you needs you to help them heal from that experience. But you're not bad because something bad happened to you. It's just something that happened to you. All we care about is you and how healing these original injuries is going to make your life so much more joyful and expansive and harmonious and beautiful.
That was really beautifully and well said. And a lot of the questions that I asked, there's definitely selfishness behind it where I want to learn myself. And so I'm just going to be obviously very transparent in when I was reading your book, I always take it in, right? Like, okay, how does this apply to me? Does this apply to me? What am I trying to fix? What resonates? And the part about being a high-functioning codependent and where does it come from? You said it earlier. Who does this remind you of and where does it come from? It made me start to think about how my dad, who I love more than life itself, he was a beautiful caring father. He still is. Like, I still sit on his lap like I'm daddy's girl. So paint the picture. I fucking love my dad. But as I'm reading your book and it's saying, why are you high functioning? What's your personality type? How do you show up? I started to realize my dad was in a very stressful business, very stressful, and billions of dollars were at stake. And so he was very often growing up, even though my parents were divorced, he was very quick to anger. He was never physical. Ever. He just would go from this was a problem to yelling. And I remember as a kid never wanting my dad to yell.
Yep.
And so thinking about how sweet and calm my dad is now that he's in his 80s and, you know, he was always loving, like I said, never physically abusive ever, never verbally abusive to me, but he got angry. It was really hard for me to admit that. It was really hard for me to go, oh, this is where it comes from, without saying that my dad is bad, without pointing the finger at him, without making my dynamic with my dad now be a false dynamic.
Right.
Because I was like, oh, well, if I go back and I look at, oh my God, my dad was angry a lot, and so that's why I'm like this. Does this now change the dynamic today?
And the answer is maybe, but it doesn't mean it would be for the bad. Perhaps there's more understanding. And you don't even have to talk about this, right? Like some people would be like, well, if I have these realizations, do I need to confront my father? No, because so many of my clients, their parents have already passed. And we are doing all of this work. Like this is work within us because the experience you had with your dad is within you. So what we're talking about is how do we bring those experiences up and out, write about them, journal about them, do inner child work around them, talk about them, honor them, and go, that's why I'm afraid if somebody starts to get a little mad, I shut down what I want to say because I don't want them to yell. It's very important data for us to understand about ourselves of like, oh, this might be why I am that way. The more you know about yourself, the healthier you can be, the healthier choices you can make. And what we're doing is we're taking this unconscious material from the basement of your mind to the main part of the house, which is where we need it to be able to access it to make changes. So in a way, it doesn't involve your father almost at all unless you want it to. It really doesn't, because this experience is in your body. It's in your memory. It's in your cells. So we're talking about handling that so that you're more free.
Yeah, you quote this in the book, the Carl Jung quote, until you make your unconscious conscious, you will forever look at it, do it and think of it as destiny or fate. That, like, so true.
Blew my mind.
That's so much part of your work is making that unconscious conscious.
Yes.
And in your book, you actually talk about emotional resilience and how we need to build emotional resilience in order to make our HFC not be so detrimental to us.
Yes.
So talk to me about emotional resilience and why it's important and then how we actually gain it.
Well, we need to understand our emotions. And emotional resilience means you have to know yourself emotionally. And most of us don't. We will say, I feel bad. But saying I feel bad is not the same as saying I feel rageful, I feel hurt, I feel unseen, I feel like all the nuances of our feelings, feeling states, there's so many of them. And the more you know, the more specific you can be and the less activatable. You know, I shy away from the word trigger just because I feel like it's been used to death. And therapeutically, a lot of times when we say someone is triggered, it almost always indicates that there is a trauma, capital T.
Yeah.
Right?
Can I actually admit something right now?
Sure.
It almost feels a little shameful to be triggered.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes. Because then like something's wrong with me. When here's the reality, we're all activatable. So that's the word we're going to use instead, where you might have an amplified response to something because of something from the past that feels very similar to what's happening now. The moment you start to have the experience, you're able to go, oh, this makes sense. So I walk you through a process of becoming more emotionally intimate with yourself. And I give you an exercise in here where you start to be able to really name your emotions in a more nuanced way. Because they're not just bad or good, or they're not just happy or sad, right?
Do we say, oh, I just feel bad? Because it's too uncomfortable for me to say, I feel activated, or I feel triggered, or I feel heartbroken, disappointed.
Yep. I think it's a combination. I think that it's lack of knowledge is one, but I do think there's like a shame around being as vulnerable as it makes you when you tell the real truth about how you feel. It's one thing for me to say, I was mad. And it's another thing for me to tell you as a friend, I was embarrassed.
Oh, yeah.
I was humiliated by what happened, by what that person said to me. Oh, I felt so bad. Now, that's a different experience. But by me doing that, you know me better. You can support me and comfort me in an appropriate way, because I'm not saying I'm mad. When I'm not mad, I'm humiliated, and they're two completely different emotional states. So when we keep it this very basic, like mad, happy, sad, angry, we don't have the rich nuance of connection with other people, but connection with ourselves. When you have a life where you're so friggin' busy, you can't see straight. When you're on autopilot, it's like, go, 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 yes, yes, yes. This does not build emotional resiliency. This just builds burnout. So emotional resiliency is that we take our time to make a decision. We take a deep breath. We have daily things that we do: meditation, being in nature, moving our bodies, drinking lots of water, eating healthy foods, not being in toxic relationships. Like, we actually take care of ourselves, which makes, of course, having emotional resiliency much easier, because we're not taxing the hell out of ourselves. So it's really a lifestyle that we're talking about.
That's so important, because I never really thought about the importance of it. Because it's like, yes, people tell you to sleep, people tell you to drink water, right? And it's just like, okay, yeah, sure. Like, I used to really be that person. I was like, okay, cool. Until the idea of hangry, when that really hit me, it kind of was like an aha moment, where it's like, all right, Lisa, if you can get super irritable, moody, snap at someone just because you haven't eaten for a few hours, now think about what that knock-on effect looks like if you don't sleep for weeks and weeks on end, if you don't have the energy to take care of yourself weeks and weeks on end. How does that start to then echo in the way you respond to things, the way you show up for things, your friendships, your relationships and stuff like that? So it was definitely super important for me to acknowledge it. But then for me to then actually gain the emotional resilience was a whole different ball game. So getting the sleep, taking care of yourself, I think is super important. But then what happens if you're doing all that and then someone comes to you and then, let's say, they disrespect you and they do activate you? How are you, in your tendencies, able to navigate that? Let's say when you don't have all of your wherewithals with your sleep and your diet and all of that.
Well, part of it is you have to be proactive and plan, right? Because if you know that you're that person, that you don't want to have this spontaneous argument with someone, you can say, hey, time out. I don't have the bandwidth for this right now, but I will have this conversation this afternoon. I can circle back around 3 if that works for you. Like, we find ways to expand the way within ourselves, how we're going to deal with it. And listen, some people would be like, no, I'm not waiting till later. And you're like, but actually, if I don't participate, then I guess you'll have to wait until later. So I asked nicely. That is my simple request. It's a boundary. I don't want to have this conversation when I'm not at my best, and that's right now. I'm too tired. I need to get something to eat, and it's not going to be productive. So can we make 3 o'clock work? So in a way, we're being proactive to what we need. And listen, people are going to disagree with us all of life, all throughout life, and that's okay. We're not fragile. It's just about having healthy enough boundaries so that we set limits as to people's access to us that we don't want to have access to us. You know, you don't have to do that business plan for someone she texted you once in 10 years. You are not required to do that. Our job is to prioritize our preferences, our desires, our limits, and our boundaries. And that really is it. And even though people love to think that that's selfish, the truth is it isn't, because when we do those things, we are so good for the people in our lives. Because I'm not looking for you to fill my bucket, because you can't. There are some things that shit is just an inside job We just got to do it ourselves. Other people can't do it for us. And a lot of times when we're looking for them too and they don't, now we're pissed. I'm so sick of the phrase self-love and people talking about self-love because you're like, what? What does it even mean? Self-consideration is about actions. I consider myself first in all my relationships and all of the things that I do. I'm doing what I want to do. And I'm not talking about when you have children, right? You have kids and a kid needs to be picked up from ballet. I'm not talking about self-consideration. I don't feel like doing that, right? Obviously.
Let the kid walk home.
Exactly. Too bad. Like, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about in adult relationships and in your career and in your adult friendships that you really think about. Instead of being the auto yes person to get the validation outside, you really think, am I going to have the bandwidth to do that? Do I want to? We have a perfect example of this. Last time I was in town. We actually had a plan. We were going to film a bunch of content together and do a bunch of great things. And you got in touch and you were like, I really am not feeling great.
That was really hard for me to do, by the way.
I'm sure it was.
Because I was like, I want to do content with Terri.
Yep. But I didn't care. I go, well, I just want to see you. So how about we just have lunch? And you were like, sounds great. But do you understand, if you had not cared about me enough to tell me the truth, I'm going to cry, then you would have done it resentfully, exhaustedly. It wouldn't have been good anyway, thinking that my motive for coming was that. But my motive for coming was you.
Why are you getting emotional?
Because it is emotional. For the honesty that the love that you showed me by being honest, that's what makes us friends.
That was really hard for me to do. And I think because we had built such a friendship, it was one of these, okay, I really, really want to do a bunch of stuff with you. I wanted to like do all these crazy things. And I was like, I'm so burnt out.
Right.
And part of me was like, do I just cancel?
Right.
But in that moment, I was like, no, I actually just want to hang out with you. But it becomes, you've said this multiple times, but it forced me to be vulnerable with you because I could have got rejected.
Yes, exactly. But then it deepens the friendship because you tell the truth and then I show up and can hold space for where you are. Like, you don't need to be anything for me. I just love you for who you are and love being with you. You know what I mean? So it wasn't like that type of a thing. But that's a perfect example of it did require you to be vulnerable. And it's okay because we have to go back to remembering that we are not that fragile. It would have been very disappointing if I turned out to be an asshole,
Yes,
right?
it would have,
That would have been a real bummer. But I didn't, and I'm not. And what we gain is the deepening of the friendship of like, we can be real with each other, right? We can tell the truth. And that's what makes friendships and love relationships satisfying, is being our actual selves.
And making sure that we're always very honest. I've had other people, right? This is why I was so hesitant, because I've had other people reach out to me like, oh my God, Lisa, listen. And it's like, oh, okay. And then something's changed. And then they ghost me after that. So I am speaking that I was hesitant towards you and having to be vulnerable, coming from a place where I've done that and been rejected and felt completely used. But part of me, I used to say, so the language, going back to something we said earlier, was like, I was taken advantage of. I was taken advantage of. And I was like, hang on a minute, Lisa. The phrase I say to myself is, no one can take advantage of you without your permission.
Yes.
And so I reflect back to say, okay, I did that thing for that person. Where did that come from? Okay, I genuinely cared about that person. I genuinely wanted to help them out. Okay, Lisa, great. I know where that came from now. How did they respond? Oh, okay, they responded like this. I then made 1,000 excuses for them responding like that to protect my own ego and my own self-esteem. And I was making excuses with them. And then I realized that then became even more toxic for me. And so this is all my evolution. And then that's why I hesitated, because I was like, okay, I love Terri so much. Please not her, you know, like, like that moment where you're like, I really freaking hope. And I think a lot of people have done that with friendships and relationships where you've been burnt before. So you try this new relationship. There are certain things that you really care about and you like, but they still remind you of your past relationships. So now you're more hesitant to do that one thing that your past ex may have punished you for, mocked you for, or left you for, which then trains you, quote unquote, to then not do that again.
Yes.
And so my hesitancy was, I love you so much, I don't want to lose this relationship.
Right.
But I had to remind myself that if you were the true friend that I've made up in my head, then you will respond with kind.
Of course.
If you don't, then I have made up a story of my relationship with Terri in my head.
Yep. But you have to look at how much you've grown and changed. So what ends up happening is, even though we have a fear of the past, if we're evolving, the likelihood that you're going to attract the same type of person that you would have 8 years ago or 5 years ago is small. Because as we evolve, it's almost like being on one street when you're at a certain level of mental health. As we evolve, it's like we move to another street and we attract people on a similar level of mental health. So the healthier you get, the healthier you attract.
That's so true. Now going to where we're talking about emotional resilience then and boundaries. I personally, I don't want to say for everybody else, but I'm just going to project that most of us find it even harder to set a boundary when we're having an emotional moment. When we don't quite have the emotional resilience yet, it's harder to set a boundary in those moments. And the 176 things that I love about you is that you give people these scripts where in those moments, if you don't yet have emotional resilience and you don't yet have the strength to actually set those boundaries, you have scripts that people can do. So what are the scripts that you find most difficult for people around you to actually say and set boundaries? And what are those scripts that you advise them to use?
I think that with high functioning codependence, saying no is very difficult.
Literally just the word no.
Just saying no, just not being able to do the thing the person wants you to do, letting someone down, not being able to just say, sure, yes, I'll do it. So I think that a lot of times it's helpful to just learn to pause. So much of what we're talking about is we need a pause. So instead of the automatically saying yes, we're going to learn to give a maybe. We're going to learn to not have to give people immediate answers in our lives because we don't have to. Actually, we determine when we give people answers, but a lot of times we feel pressured, like, I have to say yes right now. No, you don't. So we learn to give a maybe. So when someone asks you to do something, you say, I need to check with Tom. I'll get back to you on Wednesday. I need to look at my calendar. If you're at work and someone's asking you to take work from them, I actually need to see what's on my plate right now before I can commit to that. I will take a look and I'll let you know on Thursday, right? They're asking you to go to some outside stupid concert you don't want to go to. You go, let me check with my partner. Or if you know you don't want to do it, it's also okay to say, that's not my thing. I don't like outside concerts. I don't like bugs. I don't like sun. I don't like whatever it is that you don't like. Obviously, I don't like outside concerts, but but it's so much easier when we give an auto yes. It is so much easier to come back and give a solid no. And it is so hard when we give an auto yes to stuff we really don't want to do. We're going to find a way to get a migraine on that day. We're going to find a way to not actually do it. We let people down. We might lie about why we don't do it. Like, it's really hard to like force yourself, or we do it and we're so friggin' bitter that our energy is betraying us, even if we're like fake smiling. But people feel that. And why? Because we're afraid to say no. So I think that the beginning of getting out of that over-functioning can be just realizing, anyone in auto yes, and this is really all about boundaries, and that you can learn to say, hey, I need to think about it, because that's not a crime, and I'll let you know, and then get back and tell the truth if you don't want to do it. Say no. That's the beginning of gaining back bandwidth in your life, because the more crap that you do that you don't want to do, the more bitter you become.
It feels like there's anxiousness in that silence between someone asking you something and then you responding. And I think that that's why a lot of us try to just fill that gap with like, yeah, sure. And now you're like, phew, escape that like awkward dynamic. But then of course, to your point, you then get super bitter afterwards.
Yes, and instead, when we are proactive and we plan ahead, you have something to fill the silence. They say, you want to come to Chuck E. Cheese for my kid's eighth party or whatever it is. And in your mind, you're like, hell no. You can just say, I need to look and see what we're doing on Saturday. I think we might have plans, but I'll let you know, right? You have something automatic, which is don't give the auto yes. just don't. Because in every time we do that, when it's something we don't want to do, we're self-abandoning, which is bad for our self-esteem, which is bad for our relationship with that person. Right now we resent them for wanting us to go to Chuck E. Cheese. We blame other people. But I think we have to just establish that people can and will ask us to do the most ridiculous shit, always, in life. It's just people. And it's up to us. We don't have to get mad about it. We just have to learn how to have healthy boundaries and not do it, and not feel compelled. And understand what is your side of the street, what is not your side of the street. But it's like, I used to get mad at people for asking and being like, you're so entitled, rather than, what I was really mad at is they were putting me in a position to have to assert a boundary that I didn't know how to assert. But now I do, and so do you. So it's okay to just say, hey, it's not my thing. I hope you guys have a great time.
Yeah, I love that. So I'm just going to throw a couple of other scenarios at you,
Sure.
if you're cool. So if you're an HFC and you are in a dynamic and someone has made you feel used, so, and they keep coming to you, they're taking advantage of you. How would you respond in a moment where you're feeling that?
Well, if you're really doing the work and you did this book, you would realize they didn't make you feel that way. And as my friend Lisa Bilyeu would say, nobody takes advantage of you without your permission. Actually, I do believe that's an Eleanor Roosevelt quote, but yes. So I think that the real question is, how do we manage our mismanagement of our effort in that relationship? That's an inside job. That doesn't even involve that other person. We need to go, okay, let me see. Who does this person remind me of? Why do I feel like I can't say no to them? Right? Where have I felt like this before? So we use those 3 questions for clarity, which are in the book, and is foundational part of my work, where we're always trying to clue into, is there a repeating relationship reality happening here? Right? Am I behaving this way because they remind me of my scary parent or of my bully sister or whatever the situation is, which helps us be able to make changes. If we go, oh my gosh, I couldn't say no to my boss because he reminded me so much of my father. Now that I go, he's not my father, I can say no to him because it's the adult me who's in charge instead of the kid me who's in charge. That make sense?
So in that moment, there's no need to respond of like, I really feel like you keep using me or things like that. Because I'm just thinking about how dynamics end up and where relationships go wrong through the communication. So assume you haven't done the work and then this comes up.
Well, my invitation with too much is do the friggin' work, because here's the thing. You can have a conversation that says, I feel like you take advantage of me. I feel used by you. But then I want to go, stop letting them use you. Why are you doing that? That's you, right? So, and people who are users, they're not going to stop just because you say that. So your job is to set a limit on what it is that you're doing, or to ask for what you need. Perhaps you're not asking for any reciprocation in that relationship is why you feel used. Maybe what you're doing, you actually want to be doing, but you would just like them to be doing more, right? And I don't mean tit for tat. I just mean in general. You want friendships where you put in the effort, I put in the effort. You text me, I text you. You initiate a call, I initiate a call. Like, it's not always one person doing it, because then that doesn't feel good, and then you do feel used or unimportant or marginalized. So I think it's really that we have to really dial into our own behavior. Like, why do I feel this way? How much of the time am I offering to do this? And then they're not offering back, and that's really what I'm feeling. And then you can have that conversation. But less from a feeling victimized position and more from a taking radical responsibility for the choices you've made in the relationship and saying you would like things to change. That's okay too.
I love that, by the way. I'd love for you to talk about what a secondary gain is and then how we sometimes confuse that with a primary gain.
Yes. Well, secondary gain is the unobvious gain that we get for staying stuck in a situation that we say we don't want to be in. And it could be anything. It could be, I say I'm going to get healthier and go to the gym, and I don't do it. I say I'm going to get out of this crappy relationship, but I don't do it. So the secondary gain questions that people can ask themselves is, what do I get to not face, not feel, or not experience by staying stuck here. So I'll give an example because it'll be easier to understand. I had a client who was convinced that she needed to lose 10 pounds before she started dating. I didn't think she needed to. I was really trying to gently encourage her to just start dating, but she really wanted to. She was doing everything right, quote unquote. Weight was not budging. She would lose a half a pound, gain a half a pound. Weeks and weeks and weeks go by. I was like, okay, this is not about weight. This is about something else. So when I said to her, hey, let's figure out what is the secondary gain about not losing the weight. So what do you get to not face, not feel, or not experience by staying stuck here? And she says, I get to not be vulnerable and be in a relationship when I'm not even sure I know how to have one. I was like, oh, you see, by not losing the weight, she now didn't have to date, even though she wanted to. That's why it's secondary gain, because it's not obvious. When we pointed it out, though, when she was able to be like, oh my God, I've been sabotaging my weight loss efforts because there's a part of me that's scared shitless to be in another relationship because I've had some bad experiences. I'm like, okay, let's talk about that. We don't need to be focusing on the weight. Let's talk about what it's really about. But that's what secondary gain, that's secondary gain in action, what it can do for you. I had another client who, during the pandemic, was drinking like a fish, which a lot of people were doing. She didn't have a history of alcoholism, so I thought it was situational. I figured perhaps when it came around, she would stop. But she was upset about it. She was like, I really don't want to drink during the week. I only want to drink on weekends. I want you to hold me accountable. I was like, okay. So she'd come in, I'd be like, how'd you do this week? She's like, terrible. I only didn't drink on Monday, then I drank every other night. I was like, okay. Next week, same thing. So then I was like, all right, this is about something else, right? This is also, because it's almost never about the presenting thing. There's a lot of times there's a parallel process going on. So I said to her, all right, let's answer the secondary gain questions. What do you get to not face, not feel, or not experience by drinking 3 glasses of wine every night? And she literally just fell out of her mouth that my marriage is over. And I was like, oh, well, that's definitely what we should be talking about. But that's what the secondary gain can do for you. So if you're stuck anywhere in your life, you can use this tool, just have it in your back pocket, and then you can start to put your efforts towards the thing that it's really about. But it's very confusing and very distracting when we're not sure of what it's about, because people are like, obviously, I don't want to stay stuck. But there is the unconscious gain. It's protecting you from something. And that's what this tool will give you, is a way to reveal what it is protecting you from.
So powerful, because when I think about how much you just stay in that cycle where it's like, okay, I really want to lose the weight because I'm going to feel good about myself. You don't lose the weight, so you feel worse about yourself.
Yep.
You say, oh, yeah, but if I lost the weight, I could date. See how useless I am. And you end up going in this complete spiral, which you're unable to recognize. And it seems so counterintuitive.
Yes, fact. It seems so counterintuitive, which is why it's secondary gain and not primary gain.
Right.
Right? Because primary gain is obvious. What, you go to the gym, what is the primary gain? Feel physically better, look better perhaps, have more energy. I mean, it's so obvious,
Yeah. Okay, so in the healing process of this, where do you hope, or can we expect to get to in having done the work and the pros of now having done the work as a high function? Because if you're high function, you're like, all right, tell me what to do. I'm going to do this perfectly.
First, order the book.
Yes,
That's what you should do. Join my community. Well, here's the thing. What's on the other side is so much expansion. Living the life of an HFC, there's a lot of constriction. There's a lot of tenseness and anger and attempting it to control and effectiveness. Right? Listen, don't get me wrong. We know how to get some shit done. So I'm not saying, listen, it's all bad. But you can take all of those good qualities when you get into recovery and bring them, and they can truly become your superpower, right? Without all that negative stuff. Much more joy, more harmonious relationships, more equitable relationships, right? Where if you feel like you have to control every aspect of your relationship, it's exhausting. Who's taking care of you? Who's treating you like a delicate flower when you need to be treated that way, even if it's only once in a while, right? There's got to be mutuality, and that is what is on the other side. Having difficult conversations, doing it lovingly, realizing you can have amazing boundaries and be incredibly loving that you don't have to be bitchy or mean or rejecting to do that. But the most important thing is you living the life that you're really meant to live, and that you don't have that glass ceiling of your own making. On the other side, when you're in recovery, the sky's the limit as to what you want to create, because you have all of this gained bandwidth that right now you're bleeding everywhere, and you do have a finite amount of it. I know if you're 25, you don't think you do, but trust me, at 60, I can tell you, you have a finite amount of bandwidth. And if we don't bring that power and that bandwidth back for the things we want to do, we only can be so successful or so happy or so intimate in our lives. So that's really the game, is living the life you're actually meant to live with so much more joy, relaxation, expansion, allowing, letting other people take care of you too, add to your life too.
That analogy of bleeding out really hit me, because when you think about, like you even said, like the finite, it's like, oh yeah, you have a finite amount of blood. And so if you just keep bleeding out, what ends up happening? You die. So
Yeah.
like that analogy actually really hits me very well. Now I will use that as a way to be like, is this a moment where you'll be bleeding out?
Yes.
Because that just hit, I mean, and plus I like war language, bleeding out, you know what I mean? Girl, thank you so much. Where can people find you and your amazing new book, Too Much, and all the content that you're doing?
Right on. You guys can go to terricole.com/HFC, and that, I have gifts for you there, and I have an HFC toolkit for you there to sort of start this process. I have a community that you can join, book clubs, we have all the things. So that's where you can find me. You guys obviously know you can find me on Instagram at terricole.com. You've been on my show. I've got a podcast I've had since 2015 called The Terri Cole Show.
If you want to learn what the narcissist will do when they lose control of you, then click here right now.
Now, here's where you gotta be careful though, Lisa, right? Narcissistic people, for their lack of empathy, lack of self-awareness, lack of regard for others, have an uncanny ability